What was the importance of the Contra movement? Rebel groups opposing the Sandinista regime were formed in Nicaragua soon after the departure of Somoza. These groups are known collectively as the Contras. The various Contra groups were composed of peasants who resisted Sandinista attempts to nationalize their farmlands, ex-National Guardsmen, anti-Sandinista business owners in Nicaragua, and Native Americans, among others. What all these groups had in common was that they opposed the Sandinistas for various reasons, including their Marxist leanings, their dependency and friendliness to Cuba, as well as human rights violations. Contras had bases in Honduras and Costa Rica, and the groups rarely worked together despite attempts by the U.S. government to unite them. One of the more famous commanders was actually Eden Pastora, the non-Marxist Sandinista who seized the National Palace in 1978, but later left the group in protest of its policies. The Contras fought the Sandinista government of Nicaragua in the Nicaraguan Civil War from 1979 to 1990. During its first years, U.S. President Ronald Reagan channeled arms, money, and supplies to Contra groups in order to counteract growing Soviet and Cuban involvement in Nicaragua. The Reagan Doctrine was a policy of U.S. President Ronald Reagan to remove governments friendly to the USSR, which included the arming and funding of rebel groups. The Reagan Doctrine essentially called for pushing communist and communist-leading governments out of power as a method of opposing the USSR during the final years of the Cold War. This was done partly through funding anti-communist guerrilla groups such as the Contras. Contra groups received significant assistance from President Reagan until 1984, when the U.S. Congress forbade any further assistance as a result of major human rights violations being perpetuated by Contra guerrillas. While fighting Sandinistas, Contras often targeted civilians in terror campaigns involving torture, rape, burning of crops, and executions. The USA escalated its conflict with Nicaragua's government by placing sea mines in its port and an embargo on all Nicaraguan products, severely affecting the economy. As a result, Nicaragua took the United States to the International Court of Justice, which ruled in Nicaragua's favor while also ordering the U.S. to pay Nicaragua for damages inflicted on the country. The U.S. involvement in Nicaragua was not only embarrassing diplomatically as a result of the ICJ's decision, but caused a major political scandal in the United States, the Iran-Contra affair that tarnished Ronald Reagan's presidency. Essentially, Reagan's officials continued supplying the Contras despite Congress's law. This was accomplished by secretly selling weapons to Iran and sending the profits of these sales to the Contras to purchase arms. This violated an arms embargo the United States had earlier imposed on Iran, as well as Congress's earlier decision with the Boland Amendment. The war caused 500,000 Nicaraguans to flee the country, villages to be destroyed, thousands killed and wounded, and economic privation for everyone involved. By the late 1980s, the Contras and the Sandinista government were exhausted from the conflict. The Contras were poorly led, no longer well supplied, and under international pressure to end the conflict. They were also extremely unpopular because of the human rights violations, corruption, and trafficking of drugs. In 1990, Valletta Chamorro was elected as president of Nicaragua. As a result, Contra groups disbanded and returned to Nicaragua in general amnesty. Nicaragua's Somoza dictatorship was established on January 1, 1937, and continued for 42 years. The Somoza family produced 3 presidents, all of whom added to the family's wealth, eventually dominating the country not just politically but also economically. While the few wealthy people in the country benefited from massive economic growth through agricultural exports, The rural masses lived in abject poverty, illiteracy, poor health care, and other maladies affected the majority of the population as a result of being ignored by the corrupt centralized government. Opposition was successfully suppressed in the 1960s, including minor rebellions by Sandinistas and Chamorro. This all changed in 1972 when an earthquake leveled the capital city. International financing assistance flowed into Nicaragua and directly into businesses of the Somoza family, alienating other businessmen. The Catholic Church joined COSIP and other groups in criticizing the Somoza regime, while Sandinistas resurrected themselves before being crushed in 1975 by the National Guard, which was operated by the Somoza family. The election of the U.S. President Carter meant that Somoza no longer had unlimited U.S. support, encouraging opposition groups who began to work together to build national and international pressure to remove Somoza. These groups joined the Sandinistas, now armed with Cuban weapons and supported by Costa Rica and Panama, and attacked the National Guard, energizing the population to resist Somoza. Fearing a civil war and the creation of a Marxist state, the U.S. helped push Somoza out of office and into exile, arranging a coalition government to take its place. This coalition, the junta, was soon supplanted by the Sandinistas, who aligned the state with communist nations, nationalized property, and supported rebels in El Salvador. The takeover of the government by Sandinistas led to a civil war with Contra rebel groups that ended in 1990. Between 1980 and 1990, the Sandinista effected much social and economic change, including improved health care, education, and women's rights, while suppressing freedom of speech and committing human rights violations. And that is the Nicaraguan War in 2 minutes and 30 seconds.